how they've interpreted the feedback that they've gotten from the guys who are actually flying the plane and who are in charge of integrating these new capabilities into their forces. So we're going to start off here with our group captain, Paul Godfrey. And Godfrey, I'm going to let you give a brief introduction because I know it's in your background there.
All right, thank you, and definitely thank you to the Defence Centre for the invitation, and to JB for the Williams Foundation. And I will back up the apology that we talked about earlier. This time for the fleet, I didn't know anything about that. I guess it was something to do with the mental system. That's me. I just wanted to, about 20 minutes of talking about F-35 and how it has been the catalyst for change within the Royal Air Force. The aim, besides not boring you, and I was a bit worried when I saw all the you guys in the audience as well, there's some clever people. I am definitely not clever, but that's what I'm going to talk about. So it is that UK perspective. That's what I'll mention. Our strategic context through the lens of the various defence reviews that we've had over the last 25 years, which is my time in the Air Force. I think, and Gary covered that quite well in terms of, you saw all the graphs essentially going down. Transition to what we call Future Force 2020, where we're going in the next 5 years, and that was set in the last Strategic Defence Review. Some lessons from the Typhoon entry into service. Did we do it correctly? It'd be interesting to get Paul Smith, who asked the question when we were both there at the beginning of Typhoon on the first operational squadron, as to whether he agrees with me, because I've not told him what I'm going to talk about, but we'll see. And then, which is, it's really exciting actually, but F-35, the entry into service, and how it really is forcing us to think differently, something that we haven't necessarily done before. That's my background. Clearly, I throw that up because I like showing off about the Spitfire at the end of it, which was in my last job at RF Coningsby, where I flew the Typhoon. Been on the Typhoon for the last 10 years. Before that, was the first Brit, or first foreigner, on the F-16 CJ at Shore Air Force Base. And prior to that was a Harrier weapons instructor. And it struck me, and answering the question that was posed earlier, but in terms of 5th gen, I've used it before. 5th gen can mean anything. You know, if you Google 5th gen, nothing comes up. But from my perspective, you know, from the sort of first, definitely the first Harrier I flew was a 2nd gen aeroplane. I don't know how it flew and was probably as aerodynamic as that telephone. But it does come down to just a couple of words, you know, and it is situational awareness, it's fusion, it's connected, it's networked, it's those sort of things. It's not stealth, although I do think the iPhone may be stealthy because my 15-year-old son has managed to lose 2 of them. But that just happens to be part of the capability. So, and also, I don't think there's anything stopping us from switching generations. So a 4th gen aeroplane could become a 5th gen aeroplane with the right inside. So that's just my take on what 5th gen means. I'm sure Chip, as the 5th gen guru, the Jedi in here, will tell us all about it. I'm currently the manager for entry into service of F-35 for the UK, and I have flown in my Typhoon capacity with F-22 on various exercises. So I've got a rough idea, but again, not on the, along the lines of Chip. So in terms of the context, essentially 6 large defence reviews that we've gone through. Defence review generally equals cut. And just a few, you can see a few bullets on there in terms of the first one, clearly when the Berlin Wall came down, the end of history as it was termed, and we started retreating to the United Kingdom aircraft carrier and getting our troops and personnel and aircraft out of Germany. We also had a lot of aging fleets, you know, so some of this hasn't been accidental, and we have had to replace certain things. The Buccaneer coming out of service, the F4 coming out of service at that particular point. 1994, frontline first. Clearly someone spun that really well because it wasn't about frontline first, it was about cuts. But we did manage to get a few upgrades, and there is a theme that, you know, we do take away with one hand and we do give back with the other. And this one, you'll see when I talk about what we've been involved in the last 25 years, that the GR1 as was and GR4 has been the constant throughout that. Has been the, you know, the real warhorse throughout that time. And we did, in Frontline first, looked at upgrade to the GR4, which gave it, and again, we're looking at transitioning between generations at that point, from second gusting third into definitely third gusting fourth generation. Eurofighter 2000 as it was at the time, which maybe wasn't the best name considering when it came into service, but we committed to that, which for us was a really, really good thing because of what that aeroplane has given us. And also the enhanced weapons. Dr. Laird has written about weapons transformation in the UK with our weapons program. And I'll talk more about that in a second, but we did have commitment to those despite the cuts. 1998 was our first strategic defence review, the first that we've had in a long, long time, and actually was really well received. Despite some various cuts, again, commitment to the Harrier replacement. Guess what? Ended up being the F-35. Eurofighter, again, that was, I think, one of the things that stopped us entering that into service properly was the fact that it was due to be cut every year from about 1995 onwards. So, the planning wasn't quite there. Brimstone, Storm Shadow, Meteor. Three of, essentially, the four weapons in our stockpiles at the moment, which are fantastic game-changing weapons. Now, we did make a commitment to that. And that 1998 was more about capability than it was about financial cuts. So it was really well received. Unsurprisingly, in 2002, we had a new chapter added to that after September the 11th, which was about Homeland Defence, which was about something that we've talked about this morning, expeditionary and coalition operations. We're getting smaller, we're going to have to think more carefully about how we do things. 2003, there was a defence white paper, essentially more cuts. However, we'd started to use the terms that you can see up there, network-centric capability. We started talking about what networks could do for us, how they can reduce the decision times. As part of that capability, they talk about having sensors, a network, and strike assets. Not surprising that F-35 fits all of those things. Flexibility and capability, the maneuverist approach, doing things differently. However, you can see there a range of cuts as well. We're getting smaller at this particular point. And then one that some of us in this room lived through in the capability area. But the last SDSR, clearly different because we put the word security in there as well, but was essentially the same thing. And this, in the context of the global financial crisis, meant that we had to make some pretty big decisions. So the Harrier Force lost pretty much overnight. The MRA-4 cancelled and Nimrod gone, and guess what? We're looking at we're looking at maritime patrol aircraft for gap filling, especially with everything that's going on at the moment. The Future Fighter Force. One thing this SDSR did give us was milestones, which we hadn't necessarily had before. We had an interim Force 15, and we had a Future Force 2020, which I'll talk about in a second. And then across the other fleets as well, with upgrades to helicopters, but a real, I think we heard the term before, recapitalisation of the fleet in terms of replacing aging aircraft. So these are things we had to do anyway, but did we do it intelligently? And as we mentioned previously, a quarter of a century of operations, 25 years, again, the amount of time I've been in, and it has just been continuous through all of those. And those ones I've listed there are only the ones that we've been dropping weapons, the disaster relief, humanitarian ops, the stuff, the helicopter guys, our personnel in component commands, and all the other stuff that's going on. It's been huge. Throughout this, clearly, mainly third generation, gusting fourth generation wars. However, the opponents, that's something worth thinking about. I'll let the academics talk about that, but more often than not, maybe second or third. And I was thinking about this when I put it together, but I don't know what the current crop of terrorism or terrorists actually equate to. Is that fifth gen terrorism if you're using Facebook, if you're using those things across the internet? But it definitely has been a quarter of a century of change. And that's what we've changed to. So from, on the left-hand side, lots of very good but single-role platforms. To the right-hand side, coming together in multi-role platforms and hugely capable with networks throughout. You can see the I-Star Force, you know, some individual platforms there bought because of the wars that we were fighting at the time. Not necessarily forward-thinking, hence Sentinel will be out of service fairly soon. And Nimrod has gone as well. And again, as I mentioned, same in the mobility side. We've got smaller, but actually the capability has gone up. So what? Over that period, I heard it was an army term actually, when they were fighting in Afghanistan, and the term was transformation in contact. And I think that's what we've been doing. But although we've transformed the equipment, have we transformed the thinking? And I don't necessarily think we have. We've been managing change, not driving change, and I think that's changing. Did we get it right? Well, I don't know. We've actually ended up with a pretty good set of capabilities as long as we can put it all together. So was it evolution or revolution? Actually, I think it was pretty much evolution. But the intro of F-35 is allowing us to think differently. Quite a few words there, but you know, essentially, as I said, myself and Paul were there at the beginning of Typhoon. For us, it was our first proper fourth-generation fighter, and it was introduced into quite a wide third-generation environment. And therefore, to us, it was just another equipment buy, and we'll go and use it like we have done previously. The initial Carter background, guys like us, had been around the world on F-jet exchanges, on high-end fourth-gen exchanges around the place. That in itself was an issue, because when you've got all of those egos in a room, and you've got 15 different ways of doing something, then there are a lot of arguments, and I don't necessarily think that we made the most out of Typhoon until we got the ab initio, the brand new guys through training, and they said, hey, why aren't we doing it like this, the Xbox generation? So I don't personally, and happy to discuss later on, Mufti, but I don't think we had a visionary approach to the end of the service of Typhoon. It definitely, again, was an evolution vice a revolution. However, if we learn those lessons properly, then we can do it with F-35 properly. That's one of the things that I think we have been hugely fortunate in the combat air world in the UK, is that we have had to bring Typhoon into service, which means that it's not a shock, which it may be for some of the other nations who've been used to sort of single platforms for a while, to bring a new capability into service. With Typhoon, I would suggest it's only now that we're starting to really realise the true potential of that platform in terms of connectivity, interoperability, fusion, the range of weapons that we're putting, and smart weapons that we're putting on that platform. So I would suggest that possibly the revolution is now beginning in the terms of the way that we're thinking. Remember, this is Royal Air Force focused. One thing I wanted to mention, I was involved in a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, which was, this started off with a conversation with BAE Systems, who were looking to transform their air sector. And they came up with essentially PowerPoint deep, a couple of ways of doing things. And so we sat down and came up with, I say we, I was told to go and sit down. There's a slightly clunky name, Combat Air Sustainment and Training Transformation. So we looked at Typhoon and we looked at the training side of it. The first thing we did was look at defence policy. With the advent of a super spangly multi-role platform, we found that squadron commanders were trying to do everything that that platform could do, which actually then reduces your capacity, and you end up being a jack of all trades and a master of none. So we looked at the defence policy and looked at what am I actually required to do? What does the government want me to do here? And with that bounds the scope of what you're then trying to do in training, which does provide you capacity so you can think about it, and actually you can do the things that you need to do better. And we had that golden thread from policy to fuel burn, which again is always good as well when it comes up to the next round of defence reviews / cuts, and you can justify exactly why you're doing things. In training, I hadn't mentioned Hawk T2 yet, but Hawk T2, it kind of snuck into service, and the pilots were starting to be trained on it. But it was only when we went and looked at it through this, we'd done a couple of studies previously, that we realised what actually an outstanding machine it is and how it does transform training. If you look at it's kind of difficult to tell unless I tell you which cockpit's which, but on the left-hand side you've got a Hawk T2. On the right-hand side there's a Typhoon. Designed, not by accident, on purpose, to be very similar, to allow the students to arrive on that conversion unit without the shock of capture that you would have coming out of an old 1970s Hawk and then getting into that cockpit on the right. And this has been huge. This has allowed us to teach the students at Valley, where they go through this training, all of the techniques that we use on the Typhoon, which means when they arrive on Typhoon, they're just essentially in a bigger, more powerful platform. So that's allowed us to download, this training download, some of the training that we do on Typhoon into what we do at Valley with the Hawk. And also the Hawk itself, the T2, is leading the field in embedded training. So you can mission plan, put threats out there, put embedded threats on the radar, the synthetic radar on the platform itself, go out, fly it, and that student sees all of these threats, can threat react to all of those sorts of things without the added expense of having to have these in and around your airspace. So it's been huge. So as I say, training download, a reduction in Typhoon conversion hours, again, which allows us to concentrate on the things we really need to concentrate on in Typhoon. Synthetics, I will maybe, it's a real change of philosophy required here. I'm looking at Anderson in the Chuck Yeager quote, and I am daring to go against Yeager on this particular front, but it's not about hours. We've gone to an event-based approach which the USAF has done for a long time. It's not how many hours I need. I can do 12.5 hours of transiting around the place, but it's what I'm doing in those events and the capability that I'm gaining. So we went from essentially EP training, emergency procedure training in simulators, to absolutely looking at mission rehearsal. How can I make myself better in doing this? We looked at Formula One, and in going to a couple of the companies, Lewis Hamilton absolutely stated that the reason he won the World Championship the first time around was because he spent more time in the simulator than anyone else. It absolutely made it second nature to him. So this was a real change, and is a real change in philosophy, which is difficult to drive, and maybe the AVM will talk about it in a minute, with seniors, because previously it's all been about the hours. It's the Yeager syndrome right there. The use of our Air Battle Training Centre, again, this kind of came out not by design, more by accident. This was RAF Wellington. It's an airland integration centre, and that's how it started, with forward air controllers in a synthetic environment and pilots in cockpits being able to fly with each other in terms of training. The left-hand side there is a story. I took a delegation of Norwegians and Dutch guys into there on just before Christmas. And in there were Typhoon pilots training for the red flag that they were going to in January. And the training wasn't, go out and do the LFE stuff. This was, with the spins that they had, the code words that were actually being used on that red flag, the procedures, which, any of the fighter pilots in here will tell you, the worst bit of red flag is getting in and out of the base, is flying in and out of that base. They were practicing all of those things. And I subsequently then went to red flag and chatted with the young guys who were there doing it. That made them so much more effective on mission one, because they kind of knew what they were doing. You go on any new operation, getting out the door is the hardest thing. So that's a huge capability that we hadn't particularly invested in previously. We've extended it for another 5 years and are trying to tie it up into a defense-wide operational network. This is linked as well. At the moment it's normal to have the AWACS guys in there, as I say, Typhoons and Tornadoes. But it's clearly not where we want to be. I left at USAF in 2003, flying linked simulators with Langley, a 4-ship of F-16s with a 4-ship of F-15s. We are way behind in these sorts of terms, but at least we're now starting to think about the right thing. These are some other things to think about. The live synthetic blend. Notice it's been called balance before. I think it was balanced because it was 50-50, you can shift it either way. But we're now looking at all sorts of different, what is the blend you require? And this is difficult. We go to our GSDL, our scientists, and ask, right, give me a study on the actual academia behind the live synthetic blend, and they'll come straight back to us and ask experienced fighter pilots what they think. So we go into to try and get the footnote on the paper is incredibly difficult. So we're just kind of feeling our way through experience. What is that optimum blend? It's different. The Typhoon OCU at the moment is about 30% live, 70% synthetic. Even though we've got the 2-seat aeroplanes, we're taking guys all the way through to first solo, if you like, just using the simulator. So some really interesting work that we're doing there. We've got one pilot currently at Coningsby who is doing a PhD in synthetics just to try and get the science behind this, because we need to spend sensibly in the future. Experience, the Jaeger thing, 3,000 hours, that means something, it does mean something, but it's quite hard to put your finger on exactly what that does mean. Because the worst thing is, for that 3,000 hour fighter pilot, is that you tell him he's going to fly this, he's not going to want to do it. So it really is a philosophy change. So we haven't done anything that with at the moment, but it's something that we looked at within this. Surrogacy. BAE Systems came to us and said, do you want us to build an F-35 cockpit as well as a Typhoon cockpit inside that Hawk? One of these things being, could you park a squadron of Hawks up next to a squadron of Typhoons, for example, where you've got a much cheaper flying hour? Do you get the same out of it? Again, and it's not new. Buccaneers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, with no two-seaters, would have a Hunter with a Buccaneer cockpit inside to go and get the two-seat experience and go and get the cheaper experience. As I say, probably a step too far for us at the moment, but definitely something we're looking at. I know the French are going there with Rafale. The live virtual construct, probably more for questions. For us at the moment, it's more the virtual construct and trying to get that right, trying to get that network simulation going. The LVC side of it, I think, will be for us maybe 15 to 20 years' time, 10 to 15 years' time, just because of what you have to do in order to make that correct and give yourself the positive training out of it. And I mentioned embedded training, which is something we need to look at in all the rest of our platforms. So F-35, because, as I mentioned, because of those Typhoon lessons, has allowed us, or has forced us really, I say allowed, but it's forced us into thinking differently as to how we're going to enter into service. And it has been the catalyst for change in the way that we're looking at things, and those philosophy changes that I've mentioned. I talked about the pilot training, whether it's you build an F-35 cockpit and get those guys used to it. Actually, we're going to go along the line of, because that 5th generation aircraft gives you, and Chip will talk about this, that's so much more SA compared to the 4th gen platform, or can do, we're going to go down the line of teaching everyone 4th gen. So when that guy or girl gets in that 5th gen cockpit, they've got an idea of what's going on in the other cockpits, so they don't just assume that everyone knows what they know. Fighter integration training is huge. As I say, I've done this with the F-22s. It's not as easy as you would think. However, when you get it right, the 5th gen assets make the 4th gen assets much more lethal, much more survivable. So it's something that we really need to look at. So for us, when you look at airspace that we have, when you throw Meteor into the mix here, you're almost doubling your shot ranges that you might be taking. So the airspace that we have at the moment isn't going to crack it. When you look at F-35 specifically, Paveway 4, and enhancements to Paveway 4 that we might get, are our weapons ranges going to crack it as well? The red areas on this slide are where we do have weapons ranges. Unsurprisingly, down on the south coast there, compared to where our fighters are based, there's a lot of airspace to cross, so we don't end up going down that way. And in Wales, yes, we use the areas out in the west, and mainly use the areas out in the North Sea. As I mentioned, they're probably not best placed for a Typhoon and F-35 mix in the future. So that's something we're looking at, especially with changes in European airspace and EASA rules. And by the way, you can just see it, I'll talk about it in a minute, but just off the side of that map are the Dutch ranges and danger areas, the Norwegian ones off to the side. This allows us to talk with these guys and start using each other even more. Low observability, again, not necessarily 5th gen. I would argue that 117 was absolutely a sort of 3rd gen asset. It just happened to have low observability. But this is new to us. This is where we need to use the lessons of the United States, because what are the security restrictions you now have in flying? It might be that I could do all sorts of stuff in the live arena, but actually I want to bring it back into the simulator so I don't give anything away. Red air, this is a huge thing. Again, you talk to 100 different fighter pilots, you get 100 different answers, but one thing from our F-22 guys is going off and flying an F-22 against an F-22 is pointless. You're just burning jet fuel for no apparent reason. So what are we going to do in terms of red air, especially in Europe in the future? Because for the countries like the Netherlands and like Norway that are going to all F-35 fleets, they are going to have a solution for it. It may be that it is all synthetic, but it may be that there's a gap in the market for anyone out there in the industry for a red air threat simulators, emulators out in Europe. So these are all the sorts of things that we're going to have to transform in order to bring F-35 in. I mentioned synthetics and LVC, just the only point there is networking is essential. You cannot do this in isolation. You need the other elements in there. And not just fighters. This is across the board from ISTAR to air traffic controllers. If I'm flying less at my airfield, then my air traffic controller is going to be less current. So we need to get those guys into the simulator as well. We need to get the fighter controllers into the simulator. Engine testing. This is crucial. If I'm going to be doing more simulation, how do I know that when I put my request in to build the bomb gets put into the aeroplane, I go mission plan, I've got all of my reprogramming stuff that I put in the aeroplane, I take it through whatever threat defense is, I drop that weapon and I do that post-analysis and then come back to the debrief. Do I know that all of that is going to work in the real aeroplane? Or do I have to press the I believe button when I go off on oxygen for the first time? That's a button I've pressed several times. Embarked ops. Now this is, originally I had Royal Air Force, Royal Navy on the bottom list, but I thought, right, these are my thoughts, so I'll take any branding off. But for us, the 5th gen aspects embarked are huge. They are for the US Marine Corps as well. We've got a 5th gen, a next generation carrier. We've got a 5th gen aircraft. How are we going to maximise the potential? You speak to Dr. Laird down the front here about the global fleet. There's a huge amount of things that we can do. In relationships, we mentioned this morning. Your term, I think, Robin, but the global F-35 fleet. The circles, randomly drawn circles that I put up there, could be training radiuses for F-35s based in those places, but for the partners that have signed up at the moment, we're not too far from each other. I only just thought of it, but if you throw in then the multinational Typhoon bases through that as well, that 4th, 5th gen integration, that covers north to south in Europe. Look at Italy as a partner there in Typhoon, in Meteor, and is buying F-35A and buying F-35B. I think we'll see a strategic shift in relationships because of this platform. And we talked about it this morning with Gary's lecture in terms of, we looked on at the EPAF nations and see how well that actually works. We've got the advantage that we can do this with both Typhoon and F-35. Intra-service. Essentially, the Royal Navy hated us when we got rid of the Harrier in 2010. But the introduction of this aeroplane and how we're having to think differently has been huge for the relationships between both the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. We've yet to break into the British Army about this and how this aeroplane, how our mix of aeroplanes could be revolutionary for the British Army. But again, I think that's something that we'll have to work on in the near future. That's just a point on the global F-35 fleet. This is an old slide from Lockheed Martin from a couple of years ago. But that is only 3 years away. All of those aeroplanes, and it's on track for that, that is 3 years away. You can see around the United Kingdom, Norway, Australia, Italy, Turkey, and the FMS customers in 2018. That is huge right there. There's been so much talk, there's so much press about the F-35, and Joe Public thinks that this thing might be cancelled at any second. Well, if you look at that, I don't think there's any way that's going to happen. We have to think about how we're going to do this properly. We don't want to fall into the trap that we did with Typhoon. I mentioned that, I won't go more into it, but how we do things, I joked with one of the Navy guys the other day that their issue was they had ships 200 years before they had aeroplanes. So they've got a very distinct way about how they drive ships. We've got to change that way in certain cases, just so we use this properly. So to conclude then, that rate of change over the last 25 years, I think, has really stifled our ability to think differently. We've been reactive, vice proactive, but I think we're getting into a point now where, especially looking at having brought an aircraft into service such as the Typhoon, evolution is the easy part. Revolution requires thought, and it also requires time. And the advantage we have with F-35, and I would suggest, Anders, that from the Danish point of view, you've got this advantage as well, and sort of looking on, depending on which, for any aircraft that you go to. But F-35 is giving us that time. And although we're flying the airplane out with the US, the Marine Corps initial operating capability this year In the UK, we're not initial operating capability for another 3 years. So it allows us to look at all of those aspects that I talked about and transform the way that we're going to do things. So overall, bottom line is that 5th gen, however you categorize 5th gen, definitely requires a different approach to realise that benefit. And F-35 definitely has been the catalyst for change in the UK. Thank you.